Hello and welcome to Landscape Photography World, the podcast for everyone passionate about landscape photography. I'm Grant Swinburne and I'll be your host on this show, talking to landscape photographers about their motivations, likes and dislikes. Dylan Toe is a landscape photographer and general physician based in Adelaide, Australia. Dylan discusses his journey from moving to Australia in 1983 to his present pursuit of photography as a hobby. Sharing his passion for hiking and exploring nature with his wife Marianne and family, they started Everlook Photography with a mission to present hyper-realistic versions of the landscapes they encountered during their travels. On their journeys, Dylan captures remarkable images, focusing on presenting nature's beauty rather than creating artistically manipulated scenes. We covered Dylan's introduction to and development in photography, his experiences in capturing landscapes, his preparation for shoots, and his insights into wilderness photography. I hope you enjoy the show. Dylan, welcome to Landscape Photography World. How are you going?
I'm good. Yourself?
Yeah, pretty good. It's not bad for a Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah, beautiful.
Whereabouts are you?
I'm in Adelaide, near the CBD.
Yep.
And
nice.
It's where I've been for many years, since 2000 and actually I first came to Australia back in 1983, so I've been in Adelaide the whole time.
Okay, wow. Why don't you start with who you are, and then we can talk a little bit about why landscape photography and what got you started on it.
Sure. So I'm Dylan Toe. I'm actually a general physician at the Royal Adelaide Hospital, but photography is a passion hobby, I guess you would call it. And I couldn't really talk about myself without including Marianne, who's my wife, because we started Everlook Photography, which is really the pair of us. And unfortunately, I say this to everyone, that she probably has the greater artistic talent.
Okay.
You can see behind me all the other kind of pursuits that she has in terms of other artistic media. But for me, I've been hopeless at all kinds of other kind of artistic pursuits. So basically, photography is an extension of my love for going hiking in nature and recording what I'm seeing and then presenting it to an audience, perhaps in a hyper stylized way. And it's always been our mission to present a version that's believable of what we've seen.
Sure.
And that's where it all stemmed from, because we used to travel a lot. We used to come home and think, gee, our photos are pretty terrible and they don't really represent the beauty of what we've seen. And so from way back as far as about 2006 or so, we started trying to work on our photographic skills to try and maximize the impact and the value of the images we were taking. And at the time, it was about when we transitioned into digital media, and that helped no end with the ability to post-process afterwards, to bring a vision that you have in your mind and your experience to life on the screen. And then ultimately, if it makes it to print, that's even better, but that's the vast minority of our pictures, unfortunately.
Okay.
And so with time, I guess the other thing that Everlook Photography got known for was around 2011, our first child arrived. That was Charlotte. And in 2014, our second child, Jamie. And part of our mission statement then was to involve the kids with our adventures. And I guess we became known for how to combine landscape photography with a family holiday.
Yeah,
and
right.
That's a consistently evolving type of pursuit, because the kids are now becoming more independent and they're actually more able to join us in longer adventures. For instance, we did our first overnight hike in New Zealand recently. So I'm looking forward to introducing them to really wilderness photography, which is my main passion in terms of shooting images. But funny enough, it's the type of images in my portfolio that, even though I value them most, probably don't make up the majority of my images, because I don't get to go on true wilderness hikes very often, maybe once or twice a year. But that's certainly the most that I value in terms of the images I've taken. And I've intentionally left photography as a hobby or a pursuit, because in that way I feel as though I'm not pressured to do anything that I personally don't enjoy about photography.
Yep.
And the great thing about having medicine as a career is that it certainly helps fund the expeditions and so forth. And also I have to have a shout out to Nissi, and I guess you could call that a disclaimer. I've been working with Nissi filters since about 2015 because they saw I was doing a lot of long exposures, and it's been a good partnership ever since, where I do some things for them and I scratch their back, they scratch mine, and replace any filters that I have lost. And as a worldwide ambassador, I'm more than happy to promote the high quality products that they have.
Yeah. Nice.
So all up, yeah, I feel very free in my photography these days because I'm not constrained with having to think about how I'm going to earn money from the images I take. And so there's no influence on that side of things as to how I actually go around shooting, or even pressure to shoot.
So how does it fit into your life? Obviously, being in medicine, that's quite a stressful in some cases, but it's usually a high pressure and long hours sort of career. How do you fit in photography in around that?
I guess to explain a little bit about that, just knowing a little bit about how you go through training might help explain that. So a lot of the hard yards are, in terms of hours, done early in your training. And so I actually finished all my training in around 2008.
Right.
And so you can then choose to specialize in areas that are more or less intense. And I chose to specialize in general medicine, which is not very procedural. So there's not a lot of after hours work. So for post 2008 onwards, I all of a sudden went from working 100 plus hours a fortnight to pretty regular hours. And so I've been able to fit photography into that quite nicely. But as the kids have gotten older and they have their sports commitments and other extra curricular activities, it's becoming increasingly difficult to shoot locally. So actually most of the images that I'm taking and presenting on social media and so forth from dedicated holidays, and the pattern of the holiday shooting would be that because I don't sleep a hell of a lot, I tend to go out pre-dawn, shoot at dawn, and then rejoin the family for the rest of the day for family activities and sunsets and things, maybe. But most of the images that you see pre-dawn, going into dawn before coming back to join the family. So that's the evolution of how it's shot. And so I guess I'd estimate I have maybe 20 to 30 shooting days a year.
Okay.
So I've just got to try and maximize how I go about doing that. And I do always have plans going into a shoot, but part of the education about self-education about how to go about photographing a scene is how to adapt to conditions as they arise, and how to go from plan A to B to C to Z, really.
Yeah. I want to talk about that a little bit later on, but what's your earliest photography memory? Where did it all start, and how did that sort of hook get set and drag you along?
So I guess in terms of trying to take it seriously, I reckon the earliest time that I can remember actually being dedicated to concentrate on producing quality images, probably around about 2008. So
Okay.
Marianne and I got married in 2007, and we weren't particularly happy with the honeymoon images that we came back from, because we actually went to Peru, did the Inca Trail, went to Torres del Paine, and really didn't get any decent images out of that. So following that, we made a much more concerted effort to be involved with teaching ourselves not only field techniques, but also post-processing techniques. And I'm very grateful to the Flickr community initially. That's where I started the social media platform. And the community then was actually quite different. Everyone was very extremely supportive of each other and through there, I was able to get in touch with some of the Pacific Northwest US photographers, and they were able to help me develop my style. But in 2008, we had some dedicated trips to Tassie to do the overland, as well as to China to go to Yunnan province. And around that time, our goal was to be able to come back with usable images really for publication.
Yeah.
And we started to get involved with Australian Photography magazine at that time. And I guess in terms of traditional media, that's when we first started to become more known amongst photography circles to begin with. But yeah, that's the origins. But I think in terms of what really put us on the map, and my fondest initial memories would have been our 2010 trip, where both of us had long service leave, and we basically took a 3-month holiday to go traveling to 5 weeks in Iceland, 3 weeks in Scotland, and 3 weeks in Nepal.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember back then, but social media was not algorithm based. It was organically reached.
Yeah. What people put up was what you saw. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And
you followed someone, you saw what they put up.
Yeah, that's right. And at that time, we were lucky to be one of the early adopters of Facebook and Instagram as a platform for landscape photography. And because we had a huge backlog of images, particularly from Iceland, which wasn't really that visited at the time, that really put us on the map. And by far our fondest memories would have been trips to Iceland. 2009 more as a scouting thing, and then 2010 spending a good 5 weeks there.
Sure.
Yeah.
So what is it that motivates you now creatively? What is it that drags you back to photography for those 30 days that you get to shoot?
Yeah. So funny enough, it's what drives me isn't the end product, the art of it all. And I think that's what makes it sustainable for me, because I still love getting up early, going for a jog, keeping fit, so I can do very long in and out hikes, so that I can do multi-day backpacking trips and still have the energy at the end of the day to head out and shoot and so forth.
Yep.
So I'm just loving getting out there and exploring whatever it is nature has to offer. And in particular, when I go on trips overseas or even to places I've been before, I'm always looking to explore places that I haven't seen photographed. And sometimes you end up uncovering gems. Sometimes they're a bit of a dud photographically, but you still had that experience in terms of planning and exploring. And that's all part of the process that keeps me going. So when I'm going on any trip, I do heaps of planning to see what kind of locations are not very frequented, try to head out there. And it's a real satisfying feeling just to be able to get to those places, even if I don't come away with images.
Yeah.
So as I said, for me, it's not the end product of producing an image that drives me. It's the whole process of getting out there and exploring. And it's almost like a serendipitous finding if I happen to produce a good image from a certain spot.
Yeah. And in terms of that, I guess, planning versus serendipity, if you like, or spontaneous photography sort of spectrum, whereabouts do you see yourself fitting? Are you a planner? Do you plan your shoots? Obviously, when you're doing it with such a short amount of time, you're thinking about where you're going to go, whether it's for a holiday or specifically for photography.
Yeah. I was going to say, locally, it's definitely spontaneous. If I just have the time, I know some spots to go to.
Sure.
And I know which places on, say, for instance, Google Maps that I've looked at before that look interesting that I haven't been to.
Yep.
So if I'm just visiting in the south coast near Adelaide, I'll try to just explore somewhere that I haven't been before. And there's no real planning there. I suppose if there's a trip planning aspect to it, in terms, for instance, if I explain the geography of somewhere like Kangaroo Island,
Yep.
there's a lot of places on the north coast that are good for winter shooting, because that's where the direct light will be, and a lot of places on the south coast that are good for summer shooting. So if we're happening to visit the Kangaroo Island in winter, I'll probably plan more to stay in places on the north coast, and then the shoots are more spontaneous from there. But and likewise in summer it'll be South Coast. So locally, pretty spontaneous. Whatever arises and the conditions is what I'll shoot. But in a overseas trip in particular, I basically create a custom Google map with all the places of interest that I could potentially go to, and it usually ends up being 5 times the number of places that I'll actually get to. So I will, and I'll mark whether or not I think that might be a good dawn shoot, a sunset shoot. I don't do a lot of astro, but potentially whether or not there's an astro shoot on offer there. And then potentially if it's somewhere like South Island, New Zealand, whether or not there are any south-facing objects of interest for aurora and things like that. Yep. So a lot of this is pre-planned out, but it all depends like what the weather gives you. And so
of course.
Yeah. For overseas trips, definitely I do heaps and heaps of planning. And even for the wilderness trips, there's heaps of planning. But when I actually get to the location, then it's much more spontaneous. Like I never really go to a location thinking I'm going to get that shot.
Yeah.
You know? So
there's no real pre-visualization of that specific image.
No, very rarely. I think these days when I'm location planning, what I tend to do is I tend to just look at Google and the types of images that people have created from there.
Yeah,
because they tend to be just snapshots, and they probably more represent the reality of what you might see there.
Yep.
The problem is if you start looking, for me, if I start looking at fine art photography of those areas, I don't know whether people have taken creative license to stretch mountains, introduce guys that weren't there, etc. So for the planning aspects of it, I'll certainly be looking at more down-to-earth images. But for inspiration, for sure, I'd be looking at the types of things that other people have created from that area. But that's not really what I'm looking at to plan.
Do you have goals in your photography? Is there an end state that you're working towards with your photography, or is it just something that, as you say, it's a hobby, so you just go with the flow and enjoy it while it lasts?
Yeah. I think if I can maintain the interest and my body to be able to keep doing these hiking trips and to do the long in-outs in the morning, rejoin the family, that'll do me essentially. Yeah. And part of the joy from coming back from a trip is creating the memories for the family video that I tend to create from every trip. So that's usually the first priority when I get back. And then second, I've just uploaded something to YouTube for the landscape photography side of New Zealand, the most recent trip that we did. So I think it's not, as I mentioned before, it's not really the production of art that drives me when I go to a trip. Sometimes when Nissi, for instance, have a new product, then I do put a bit of pressure on myself to see what images I can create with that new product. Mm-hmm. But it's because Nissi selected me because of my style. So it's not like I selected Nissi and approached them. So whenever I'm shooting for them, I'm really just shooting the way I normally shoot, just with new gear. But there is that slight added pressure to see if I can come back with something to help them promote a new product, basically.
I sometimes ask about that in terms of the inspiration to be creative and experiment with new ideas and techniques. Is that the main driver, or do you prefer to stay in your lane and just keep producing the very high quality images, but the images that you fit within your style?
Yeah, look, I see a lot of images that, I guess I could put it into two groups. There's images that I really appreciate from an artistic point of view. Yep. And there's images that I aspire to in terms of what I could create by being at the right place at the right time with the appropriate planning. And so in terms of what drives me to push myself to boundaries, it's more the latter. So I'm not really looking to create dramatic images, for instance, using focal distance blending and so forth, focal length blending and so forth, which creates really amazing images and so forth, or time blended images with daytime, nighttime blends and so forth. They all look stunning, but they're not really things that I look to create. So for me, I'm actually, this might sound a bit contrary to what a lot of artists pursue, but I'm quite comfortable kind of where I am without necessarily want to push boundaries further. And it all comes down to the motivation of getting out there and shooting in the first place. It's just about seeing and experiencing new places, or the same places in new conditions.
Yeah. How would you, if somebody asked you and they hadn't seen your work, how would you describe your style?
I would describe it as a hyper-real representation of the experience I had at that location.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's always been both Marianne and I's goal. So what we want to do is we want to present something that's believable but accentuated, and something that could actually happen. And if we, on the rare occasion that we do take a bit more creative license, then I usually spell that out in the description.
Yeah,
like
right.
the skies from Adelaide is a southern sky in a northern hemisphere landscape or something like that. Or I've stretched the mountains because I wasn't happy with the perspective that I got, and so forth. I think it's useful to disclose those things because
Absolutely.
when people look at your work for inspiration for the second category I was describing before about aspiring to actually take those images, I feel bad if people get there and all of a sudden it's nothing like what you saw on an image. So yeah, because that's happened quite a lot to me early on, which is why I developed this almost two categories of looking at images.
Sure. You put a lot of emphasis on the environment and wilderness in your work. Obviously, that's really important to you. Do you see yourself as an environmental advocate in any way?
This is something that I not necessarily struggle with, but I have frequent discussions with, particularly in Tasmanian photography circles.
Yep.
Because I think people want me with my work to actively be involved in those pursuits.
Sure.
But it's not within my nature to do that. Like I'm hoping that by just presenting the environment as it is, it will inspire people to take an interest in the environment and to also preserve it just by seeing the natural, pristine beauty of what's out there. But I'm not telling people how they should do their hiking and so forth. I perhaps naively have an inherent trust that the vast majority of people who see my work and want to visit those locations will behave in a responsible manner. And unfortunately, it's the noisy, unbehaved minority that spoil it for everyone.
Yeah, very true.
And the question is, how much responsibility do I take for the vast minority of people who do spoil it for everyone?
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that whenever I put images out, particularly of the wilderness, that the effect it has on inspiring the vast majority to take an interest in nature and so forth outweighs the negatives of that small group of pesky people who are probably more self-interested than in the environment.
You mentioned that you have not really focused on the business side of things, but obviously having relationships with Nessie and the Australian photography magazine, landscape photography magazine, etc. There's obviously people that would come to you and say, all right, I'd love to buy some of your images. Mm-hmm. Do you sell anything? You've got a website, as I understand, and you sell prints, etc. there. Yeah. How much of that, or how much of that business side of things do you pay attention to, or is it just that purely that side hustle for you?
Yeah, it is largely a side hustle. A lot of we do get some income from photography, but most of those photographic incomes have been relationships that we've developed over the years that have resulted in like a bit of a trickle income. Yeah. For instance, Nissi, it saves me from buying filters, and they pay me a certain bit to help them with translations because they're a China-based company and so forth. Other companies that we've had experience with, Picketeer postcards in New Zealand.
Yep.
So once again, back in the early days when we visited New Zealand, we became involved with them. And fortunately for us, they've exploded into be a really major postcard company. And so we get a commission from each postcard of ours that they use to sell. And so that brings a bit of trickle income in. And over the years, we've had, based on our social media presence, people have asked us to use our platform to sponsor products and so forth, Icebreaker, for instance, and SanDisk and all that. So there's been little trickles of income that have come organically just through our presence on social media, rather than us actually seeking out sponsorship deals and things like that, because there's literally no pressure on us to do that. So we're quite comfortable in picking and choosing who would want to use our website, because sometimes strange things like watch companies or cosmetic companies will all of a sudden want to use
sunglasses and all those sorts.
Yeah, and I'm like, I don't really think that suits advertising. That all of a sudden would be quite jarring.
I keep having female jewelry companies saying we'd be a great fit for their brand, and I'm going, I don't think we would.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, how?
I can't see myself modelling that in my videos.
Yeah. So I can't remember the last time we sold a big print, but we do go through Riptide to sell our prints, and they do sell some, and we provide them images from time to time. So most of the income and the business side of things is through trickles from relationships that we've established over the years.
I'd like to move on to where you like to shoot. What are the places that keep drawing you back? It could be local, could be overseas, could be anywhere.
Locally, there's a lot of amazing seascapes around South Australia.
Sure.
Internationally, we've been to New Zealand by far the most, and we've been to the Pacific Northwest in the US. There's a heap of. I probably shouldn't screen share, should I? Because this is a podcast.
You can screen share if you like. That's fine.
Yeah. But if look around the south coast of South Australia, there's a lot of hidden nooks that aren't necessarily easy to get to, and bit by bit over time, I'm starting to get to some of them. And a lot of the time, I don't get very good images that come out of them. But once again, the exploration process is very worthwhile anyway. And around Kangaroo Island, haven't been for a couple of years now, but that's definitely a favourite spot to visit in South Australia, just because of its rugged coastline and wildlife and so forth. So they're definitely the local favourites. I'd love to explore more of the Flinders Ranges, and one day, if I ever get into aerials, maybe head up to Lake Eyre. But because aerials belong in that category where I appreciate it for art without necessarily aspiring to produce them myself. And the reason for that is I'd much rather be spending time hiking, camping and so forth than sitting in a plane taking photos. So that speaks to just having the experience rather than trying to produce images. So that's I don't see myself going into aerials, but in South Australia there's so much potential to be doing aerial photography, and every once in a while I just take Google screenshots from Google Maps as to where might be a good spot, but then I've never then had the desire to follow through and arrange a flight and so forth. But in terms of where overseas, New Zealand is definitely a go-to place for photography, particularly because we just don't get that type of alpine scapes, even in somewhere like Tasmania, which is probably the closest that you have to there. You don't have 3,000 metre high mountains that are snow-capped most of the year and so forth. So New Zealand's got so much to offer. And even though Australia does as well, the difference is that I find New Zealand is so much more concentrated. There's much less commuting to get to between amazing places.
You don't have to drive 5 or 6 hours to get from point A to point B.
Yeah, that's right. And so that's one of the problems in South Australia in particular. There's a lot of nothing in between great spots. But I found in New Zealand that's particularly handy for a family holiday where, you know, I don't have to drive too far at dawn to get to a spot and then come back at a decent hour to then rejoin for family activities.
Yeah, you can pack a lot into a short period.
Yeah, but look, my favorite, the place where I've done the most hiking is definitely Tasmania, and Tasmania is the place where I feel most in the wild, so to speak. I'm sure there are places in New Zealand, but because I haven't done the kind of exploration in remote areas to the same extent as Tasmania, I haven't had that same experience in New Zealand. Most of what I've done there is hut-to-hut hiking there rather than camping expeditions, because it is overseas and you have to bring all the stuff over.
Yeah.
And there's just a bit too much luggage when you're bringing
hiring tents and whatever is a bit challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tassie's definitely the Australian location that I go to, and in particular kind of Southwest National Park where the Arthur Ranges and so forth, that they're by far, that range is just incredible in terms of the topography and the scenery that you get.
Yeah. If you could retire at one of the places you've shot, which would it be?
I reckon either Hobart or somewhere in South Island.
Okay.
Those would be the two places I think that if the body was still willing when I retire, to be able to explore all these locations, and I'm hoping to keep the body in good shape for that, then I'm sure I'd be out and about most days of the week doing some kind of exploration.
What's your most memorable shooting experience?
I think for me, there was a morning in the Western Arthurs at Lake Oberon where we had basically, Luke and two other photographers, we'd been holed up in a tent for the previous kind of 24 hours with extreme winds and a lot of rain and so forth. And so when it cleared up on the last morning, it was just magnificent with all the rays of light shining through and so forth. So that's probably one of my most memorable experiences there. And I think I've given you a copy of that particular image in the folder that we shared. But the other one most recently was being on top of the Eastern Arthurs, where there was basically a rip-roaring aurora over Federation Peak.
Oh, fantastic.
I really didn't get great images because I had brought just limited kind of focal length lenses. But if you look at Luke's portfolio, he's got an amazing image of Federation Peak fully exposed in the moonlight with the aurora going in the background as well. So that was pretty magical being up there.
Nice. What about horror stories?
Look, on the most recent trip, this one's still poignant. We were driving back from Milford Sound to Taianau, and we had parked halfway at a place called Nobbs Flat.
Yep.
That's where a lot of people just stop off to use the toilet, but there's actually a really good waterfall there.
Okay.
So as everyone was going off to the toilet, I opened the boot to grab my camera bag out, and because it was on a slope, half the luggage kind of tipped out. So I was trying to shove in all the luggage, and because I was going to use the camera bag, I left the camera bag out. And because I didn't want this to happen again, I thought I'd better move the car. And unfortunately, as I was reversing, I basically ran over my camera bag.
Oh, no.
Yeah. I was very amazed that there wasn't more damage. Essentially, what happened was that the 14 to 35 that was attached to the camera body was completely crushed.
Oh,
and so I didn't have a wide angle to work with for a bit. And somehow the R5 body that the lens was attached to survived. So that speaks to the durability of that body.
Definitely.
And also the 100 to 500, which was also rolled over. The only problem that had was getting tight around a 300 to 500 zoom. So it was pretty lucky in the end. That was the extent of the damage that was caused. But
yeah, amazing.
As I ran over that bag, it's like, oh God, I think I literally heard something crunch and thought, that's trouble. But I've actually had pretty good health out in the wilderness. I haven't had anything really disastrous happen in the field, apart from taking some time to work out what camp foods agree with me, and the guys who've gone hiking with me have definitely known me to have the camp runs.
Yeah, those dehydrated packets are not always agreeable, even just taste-wise.
No, so I've actually gone super basic, and so on all these multi-day trips now, basically all I do is I bring the deep freeze-dried rice and
Yep.
put in some chicken stock, bring some Parmesan cheese, and eat a good serving of that every night with some jerky, and that's it. It's a bit monotonous, but it's definitely better than having the runs.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds like a great lesson. But what has the practice of photography taught you about nature?
It's taught me that you really, particularly in harsh environments, you can't underestimate it at all. So, for instance, using the Eastern Arthurs as an example, to get in, you park at a place called Scott's Peak Dam, and you need to walk about 36 to 40 k's just to get to the base of the range.
Yeah, right.
And along the way, there are multiple creeks that could flood.
Yep.
And so you're in a bit of strife if you go in there without knowing what the weather conditions might hold, and bad weather comes in that cuts you off from your exit route. And for argument's sake, say you don't have enough food or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's taught me that nature rules all, and you're really at Mother Nature's mercy, and you have to have your senses about you. It got to the point where one of our group members, who's very experienced in hiking, just basically had a bit of I think got extremely anxious at the base of the range just from the sheer isolation of it, and so stayed at the bottom instead of going up. So it's the opposite of cabin fever that could happen to you out there, and you've just got to be safe out there and have contingencies. All of us had our emergency personal locator beacons and so forth in case we needed to activate it and so forth.
Yeah.
So yeah, learning just being responsible in nature as well. The other kind of adverse thing I think I've learned about nature is that you can see the impact of foot traffic in certain locations that threaten to damage certain locations.
Yeah.
So one prime example of that would be a place called the Porkai Tarns in Mount Taranaki in New Zealand.
Yep.
Back when I visited in 2014, people like to go around behind the tarn to get a reflection shot of Mount Taranaki. And over the years, that's just become increasingly boggy because of the foot traffic, even though it's not a lot of foot traffic. And so they've had to put in...
it's just a delicate environment.
Yeah, that's right. It's nature can be very powerful, but also fickle at the same time. A delicate at the same time. You try not to damage anything, and if I'm walking in sensitive areas, I'll try to avoid using my boots and things like that, or try not to go in there at all.
Yeah.
I think it's always a contentious topic about whether or not you go off trail to get shots. But I guess for those
some wilderness areas, it's difficult when there isn't a trail in the first place.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a minimal trail, for instance, in the Eastern Arthurs and so forth. But I guess you've got to use your judgment as to whether or not the image is worth, one, your safety, and secondly, whether it's worth potentially damaging the environment to get to.
Yeah. I'm interested, I guess, in those wilderness sort of excursions that you do. The amount of prep you talked about, having an EPIRB and thinking about the weather conditions that could be upcoming in the days following when you start out. How much planning or how much time and effort do you put into your planning of those sorts of trips?
I would say I'm probably moderate, because I know some people who go out there without doing a lot of planning. Sure. And then I know other people like Luke who put massive amounts of effort into planning. And other groups I've been with have been putting spreadsheets as to the exact weight that they'd be carrying and so forth.
Yep.
For me, I just make sure that I have enough food, enough spare change of clothes to not be completely sodden, and then all the essentials. And then I pack that into a bag and then take it for a dry run locally. to see how that all fits together, what the weight is, and then see if I can economize from that point of view. And I'm not really planning for, when I'm doing those multi-day trips, I'm not really planning photography shoots, and I'm not going there with a specific image in mind. That's definitely more about the experience. But so in terms of gear planning and so forth, it's a pretty fixed routine now in terms of sleeping gear, clothing, outers, waterproofs, and nutrition and so forth. But the minimal kind of photography image planning, but a lot of it for me comes down to physical condition as well.
Right.
So I do a lot of running locally and running up hills and things like that, because I guess I've been on trips where it's so tiring to get from location to location with a heavy pack that the temptation really is just to set up camp and stay in there the rest of the time until you got to move again. But it's nice to have the general fitness to have the energy to then get out and shoot without forcing yourself to do so.
Right.
And being fresh enough so that you can make a decent fist out of shooting and have the clarity of mind to adjust to conditions and things like that. So, funny enough, most of my fitness work that I do at home is really as a just in case. So I do my next wilderness hike and get to a location quickly, so I've got plenty of time to explore once I'm set up.
Sure.
Yeah.
What about the trimming the camera bag down? How do you select which lenses, what tripod, etc.? What's your process going through your mind when you're setting all of that up?
So for a camping trip, normally what I would bring is just one body, a wide angle, which is currently the 14 to 35 that I'm using. And then if I'm going to be in the mountains, then one long lens. And though I would love to bring the 100 to 500, it's just way too big. So I settle for using the 70 to 200 f4, which is great quality, and it's probably the lightest kind of zoom lens of that kind of focal length that I have. So it's those two lenses. And then instead of bringing heaps of batteries and things, normally I just bring a decent power bank that will charge everything that I've got, including the camera batteries. So for the Eastern Arthurs, which we projected to be a 9-day, but turned out to be a 7-day hike, I just brought one spare battery and charged in between. Try to shoot economically when I'm actually shooting. In terms of filters, I don't bring a lot when I go on the multi-day trips. I basically bring a hard case with a 6-stop and a polarizer and the filter holder set up, and that's about it. So it's really a lot smaller than what I would normally bring, and I'm usually carrying that in a front pack so that I can whip out the camera and shoot some images as I need.
Right.
Sometimes you can't have the front pack on, though, when you're doing a lot of almost rock climbing stuff in the Arthurs, but in general, that's the kind of setup that I have.
I guess it does depend a lot on the terrain you're traversing.
But that's the multi-day kind of setup. But if I'm doing a long in-out, then I'll just bring the normal camera stuff, because that's still way lighter than the hiking pack that I'd be used to carrying. What do you normally carry in your bag?
I've trimmed it down to a sling bag with 3 lenses in, usually two or three and one body, and that usually covers the 70 to 200 range. I got a 16 to 35 and a 24 to 105. Which sort of covers that. I've also got a 2x converter for the 70 to 200, but it depends on where I'm going as to whether or not I'm going to take that. If I know I'm going somewhere where I'm likely to need that extra reach, then I'll stick that converter in, because it's a nice lightweight and better than trying to take, as you say, a 100 to 500.
In my normal pack, I would have the 14 to 35 attached to the camera, plus
Yeah.
the 24-70, plus 100-500, plus the filter setup. And then normally what I also have in my pack, apart from the tripod, I'm using a Surui 2 series, so it's intermediate weight.
Yeah.
I find the really light hiking tripods.
Too
If
light and
if
not
you're
sturdy
going,
enough. Yeah.
if you're going all the way out in the wilderness and you're likely to encounter, particularly in mountains, very windy conditions,
Yep.
I just don't really want to risk having tripod shake
Yeah.
introduced into images, because I am taking a lot of long exposures. So for that reason, I just my usual kind of tripod setup.
Yeah.
But over and above that, normally what hangs off the side of my pack is some kind of waterproof cover, as well as some micro spikes in case there's really slippery environments to be in.
Yep.
With a preference not to use them unless I really have to, because they can scuff up the ground a little bit.
Shooting alone or with other people?
It depends on the circumstance. Most of the time I shoot alone, and I find the process of doing that almost what I get out to do landscape photography for. It's like a release from, like, being in the nature by myself as a solitary experience is a stark contrast to working in huge multidisciplinary teams within a tertiary hospital and so forth. So it's like the complete opposite. But if I'm going on a multi-day hike, then I feel much more secure if I'm going in a group. And particularly if we're going to precarious places, it just adds that safety factor to be there with other people. And on the last trip, for instance, Luke had some, what do you call them? Ultra high UHF radios that we could use to contact each other as well, as an added layer of safety.
Yeah.
So yeah, generally speaking, the part of the motivation is to escape the masses, basically. But in dangerous places or in remote wilderness, definitely a preference for group shooting.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What about the process when you bring the images home? Are you straight into editing and get them?
Oh, yeah.
Or are you one to let them marinate for a bit?
Nah, they're like when I give photo talks at photo clubs and so forth, the main thing I focus on is talking about the images and stories that go with them. So that's why I'm super keen when I get home to just have a look at what these images look like on a big screen, because I don't bring anything. I don't do any editing on the road or anything like that.
Yeah.
They just stay in the camera, and the laptop's basically used as a backup device, and I might take a sneak peek at some of the pictures, but there's no kind of proper editing that I'm doing on trips and so forth. So when I get home, normally what I do is I stick the card in the computer and create the Lightroom catalog while I do all the other kind of unpacking and so forth. And then once all the cleaning up and unpacking's happened, I sit down at the computer and start trying to choose which images I want to start editing first.
Yeah.
And I don't, there's no real process as to which image I'm going to do first. It's just a question of eventually getting to all of them. Like, I think we returned from the New Zealand trip on the mid-October, and I've probably edited most of the images that I want to from now, while the experience is still fresh. And I think doing that gives me the advantage of the immediate recall of the experience, and that kind of frames how I might edit a picture to bring in the atmosphere that I want to convey from being there, as opposed to trying to remember in the future, and then probably just the temptation to introduce more artistic elements to the image that weren't necessarily reflective of the experience there. That's one of the things I think may happen if I wait too long to start editing images. So yeah, I've been spending a lot of time editing these recent trip images, just to not to get them out, but just because I really love seeing all those memories come to life again and be immortalized in the final images.
Yeah, sure. And what does the edit look like, the edit process itself? Is it long and drawn out per image, or is it short and sweet, get them sorted and go through them?
Depends on how well I've done in the field.
Okay.
So if there's been a scene where I've captured everything as a single image, which is the goal, so that's why I use filters a lot.
Yeah.
My goal is to be able to capture as close to a representation of how I remember the scene in a single image. So those are often the images that I'll gravitate to first, because I've got a lot of presets for common things that I do to images, that in the form of a Lightroom preset as well as Photoshop actions. And a Lightroom preset will be the first thing I go to, and then the Photoshop element will be fine-tuning things down to specific localized areas of the images that I want to affect change and so forth. So yeah, it could be anywhere from literally a 2-minute job to if something just hasn't turned out as I had hoped. And I think the most common scenarios where images haven't turned out as I've hoped, places where there are extreme colors. So if you're in a forest with extreme greens, often it will just look pretty weird on RAW to begin with.
Yeah. A lot of people struggle with their greens when...
Yeah, that's right. I've actually got a few actions to help me along with getting the desired result of greens, because I find I'm doing the same thing quite a bit. And the other one would be the very vibrant sunrise that you remember, but then the whole color palette and everything's completely different when you look at it on the RAW file, and it just takes a bit of work to bring that back into an image.
Yeah.
And naturally, the images that you've shot as exposure blends, panoramas, focus stacks, and so forth, a lot of those come in the down the track basket because it's too much work. But
I always leave my panos for some reason, because some of them I'll jump straight into, but mostly I think I've probably got, I don't know, probably about 50 or 60 ones that I know would be good panoramas, but I've just never bothered to actually stitch them together and start the editing process.
Especially if they're exposure blend panos.
Yeah, that can. Yeah, that's one of my issues. Is I do quite a bit of exposure blending, and therefore the panos, they can be anywhere from 15 to 30, 40 images, and that just takes a lot of computing time and effort to pull it all together.
It's funny
getting the range when you're doing a pano, that range correct, so that each layer that you're then going to blend is a bit of a challenge too.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because there are some panos I've shot from this recent trip that they're the images I haven't touched yet. So got a few panos to go from there.
Do you? I'm interested actually, because it might help both of us. I'm not sure, but do you do your blends first so that you've then got a final image and then stitch the pano together, or do you stitch the panos together in their sort of multiple images?
I do the blend first. Yeah, I do the blend of each individual file first, because
I've found that to be much more effective personally. But...
yeah, because sometimes when you stitch each exposure into separate panos and try to blend, sometimes it don't align.
Yeah, it gets weird and whacked out. Yeah. That's what I found.
Yeah.
What do you think is the biggest challenge facing photography right now?
I think the main challenge that I see for photography, once again, coming from a standpoint of not necessarily having financial interests in it, but I can see for those who use photography as a career, the challenges of advances in digital manipulation, and especially AI coming into all of this, because AI is definitely in that first basket that I recommended, that I described as in, yeah, they look like great images, but it's never something that I would aspire to create.
Yeah.
And I think photography, part of the reason why I got into photography was an element of authenticity to the images that you're presenting. Yep. Even though our mission statement is to create hyper real images, they are a representation of what's out there. So when fiction and reality blur in the extreme, I think that paradoxically threatens photography in terms of bringing it back into the fold of other media instead of standing on its own.
Yep.
Because with all other artistic media, like what Marianne's participating with, watercolors, oils, pastels, etc.,
Sure.
All of those are, you can be as fictional as you like, and there's no question as to the authenticity of those.
The artistic license is unlimited.
Is limitless, yeah. But particularly because photography has been used for genres such as photojournalism, and if it starts to threaten the integrity of that, then photography as an art is a bit threatened. And also the other element of it from a environmental point of view is that photography is great to be used as a kind of conservation tool in terms of documenting what certain places look like at certain times.
Yeah.
As a reference to the future as to how, for instance, climate change or how the impact of visitation from too many visitors in an under-supported infrastructure can affect a sensitive environment. All of those kinds of aspects of conservation photography then become almost a moot point if everyone's just willy-nilly throwing AI into the scheme of things and no one knows what's real and what's not.
Yeah.
And so I think selling, but unfortunately, if you're using photography as a business, then somehow you've got to make money. And if the masses out there are going for beautiful AI generated images, then I don't know how.
Resist,
yeah, it's hard to resist at least doing that as a side hustle. And there comes the conflict of when business is one of your prime objectives in photography, the conflict between doing what you love and enjoy and making it sustainable as opposed to doing what's needed for survivability in the field.
Yeah. What about the future of photography? Where do you see it going?
I think to some extent, the photojournalistic and the authenticity element of photography, I feel it's always going to be there. It's just really how much of the market the AI side of things starts to capture. And I fear that a lot, the balance between digital manipulation and AI, things is probably starting to already favor that side of photography and the pure art photography styles as opposed to representing some kind of realism. I've seen very prominent photographers even say that realism doesn't matter to them, and to me that's like a gut punch because that's so against my own ethos of why I got into photography. And look, all power to them. They have a different vision of photography to me, and that's fine. And everyone's got to, if you're in it for a living, you've got to do what sustains yourself, both in terms of artistic fulfillment as well as financial.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've got a slightly different take, and I hear what you're saying, and I know some of the photographers that you're talking about in terms of steering away from reality. But I think that shift may not be sustainable for very long, because ultimately the reason people like yourself and Luke and so forth get out into the world is the experience itself.
Yeah.
And that in itself, I think, has inherent value, and the recording of what you're seeing in wilderness areas and what people are seeing as you said, recording a location in a point in time, that in itself is actually going to be of more value than something that's just completely made up.
I genuinely hope you're right.
So
I reckon
I'm probably wrong,
it's
but
pendulum. It's probably going to be a pendulum, isn't it?
Yeah.
When it swings too far and people will realize that it may have swung too far, then it might hopefully go back the other way and more emphasis on photo.
I'm pretty sure when you go back into the history of photography, you got people like Frank Hurley and some of the early photographers, Ansel Adams himself as well, one of the most renowned landscape photographers. He used to manipulate images, and as did Hurley and numerous other photographers out there. So it's not like this is a new thing. It's just the techniques. You press a button instead of mess around with chemicals and glass plates.
Yeah. AI takes it to a whole new level, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
I think the fact that you can feed it your own images, for example, and have it give representations of actual locations to a point with whatever weird and wonderful things you've put into a text prompt probably changes it slightly, because you can imagine pretty much anything you like, whereas the Hurleys and Ansel Adams and so forth of the world had to deal with what they could capture at the time.
Yeah, that's right. They still had to actually capture something.
That's it. Yeah. How about creative blocks and challenges, those mental struggles that everybody has in their photography? Have you used any strategies to stay inspired and engaged, or has that inspiration and engagement always been there?
It's largely always been there. But look, if I come into a block where I don't feel like processing, once again, because it's not a breadwinner, I feel like I just take a break from it and then come
Yeah.
back to it when the inspiration's there. So I don't try to force things along to keep momentum and stay relevant and so forth. Once upon a time, I did put that pressure on myself, like early in the early 2000s, when Marianne and I were both contemplating whether or not we would branch off more to using photography as a business.
Yeah.
And then we started doing a lot of things like wedding photography, pet photography, and different cross genres and so forth, just to keep the momentum. And then, yeah, it would be a real struggle, for instance, after you shot a wedding and you're too tired, you're not feeling particularly creative, then it's just like a preset. Oh, this one I might edit a bit more. These days, there's really not a lot of that happening because I'm really, when I feel like editing, I'll edit a bunch of images. When I feel like relaxing and just playing computer games with my kids, I can go and do that. If I feel like emphasizing more of fitness, I'll go and do that. I think it's a potentially underrated way to go about photography, to have it funded by a real another alternative, more secure source of income.
Yeah.
And providing that it's something you enjoy as well. And I guess I'm
Well,
lucky.
this is it.
Yeah. If I can imagine it's a really tough situation if you've got the alternative income source that you're not really enjoying, then it's a real struggle. But I'm very lucky. I consider myself very lucky to be having an interest both in photography and also be very committed to the career that I've got, because I've got a strong interest in it still. Yeah.
What's your favorite thing about being a photographer?
I think the main thing about being a photographer is the ability to share experiences after I come away from the fact. So the primary goal for me is, as I keep mentioning, to get out there and explore. But once I create the image, I think I feel good about having recorded the image for myself. But then if that image can inspire people to take an interest in their locations and go out there and visit and experience it for themselves, then I think you'll get more people interested in nature, basically. And so that's, if people then write back to me and say, thanks for your advice about this, we had a really great time and so forth. And most of the time when that happens, these are responsible people. These haven't been people who have gone out there and trashed the environment and so forth. So I'm very wary. I'm very grateful when I've impacted people in a positive way to go and experience things for themselves.
Yeah. What about your least favorite thing?
I think the least favorite thing, as in any profession, is when it starts to get political.
Yeah.
So I can't avoid that in my real work because it's my real work, but I can step away from it in photography. And I think the major issues I've had largely based around accusations that because I have a relatively large social media presence, though it's not that visible these days, that if I put up an image of a sensitive area, the hordes will go there and destroy it. But because other people don't have that following, they're free to put up the same image.
Yeah.
And I think it's a strange kind of attitude to have, but that's where I've had most kind of conflict in terms of photography. And that's the justifying why I do things the way I do is probably the least favorite thing that I have to do about photography.
Do you still geotag images at all?
I don't geotag them. I'll say where they are. And if someone, it's really just an individual basis when people ask for specifics, whether or not I decide I'm going to.
Yeah.
If it's someone, if I look at their account and there's a bunch of stuff that belongs on Insta Repeat,
Yep.
and so forth, then I'll be like, look, part of the fun might be researching where this is, or it's in this vague area, have some fun exploring it yourself. But if it's someone who I see is very much into nature and conservation, I'm more than happy to share the locations and even how to get there and best times to get there and things like that. So it is
Yeah. When I shoot somewhere that's sensitive, I tend not to talk too much about it unless, as you say, you look at the person's profile and you go, well, it's somebody that I know really well. I go, well, I'm not divulging exactly how and where I got there, but if it's a public place like a beach here in Sydney,
exactly.
I'm at Coleroy Beach.
Yeah, I don't geotag anything. So I might just put a rough location. Like I shot a fair few of Dunedin's coastlines recently, which I don't think there are a lot of images from. So I'll just location, I'll put Dunedin. So it's that kind of rough area. But where I struggle with withholding information is that a lot of my exploration efforts have really come on the basis of goodwill of people sharing their own images. I haven't asked them direct, but they've made their images available online, and I've benefited from that. So I feel it. I feel it very strange for me to purposely withhold information unless I feel, using my judgment, that there's good reason to do so. So I think most of the time I'm actually quite generous with telling people where things are.
I want to bring things full circle. You mentioned the early Flickr days and the collaboration or the community that was around in those days. Where do you see community now in social media? Is there one, or is it everyone out for themselves and it's a cutthroat place?
Yeah, so I think one of the problems with social media at the moment is that it's almost too broad, and you're getting too many kind of people from everywhere trying to chime in. But at the same time, the algorithms are forcing you into this kind of almost echo chamber where you're not able to see out from where you're commenting. Then people, because you never met these people and you don't really deal with them consistently, you're not really that focused on, you're not that invested in their well-being, and they're not that invested in your well-being. But the last kind of good community experience I had was, I guess, back in Facebook, there was a group of the Pacific Northwest photographers who tried to get a group of fine art landscape photographers together to share their own experiences, put up images for critique and so forth, and try to support each other. And so that's the kind of environment that is very useful, particularly if you're up and coming into this field, to have people who have a shared interest and you feel invested in each other's well-being. So ironically, I think if the internet were be able to localize people to more realistic groups where you can actually interact with each other, that may actually help develop the photographic community more.
I think those places exist. They're just hard to find, and they're few and far between where there is, as you say, that caring about each other's well-being.
So there's, for instance, as well as Flickr, I joined a forum called Oz Photography Forum. And I've been on that since 2008, I think. And I still go there and share images and try to give critique and so forth. Because
I used to be a part of that a long time ago, and
I
think that was actually where I first came across some of your work. To be honest.
Yeah, probably, and so I still contribute because I think I'm grateful that for the role that type of forum had in my development in terms of seeing photography what it is and the community support that you can get from it and so forth. I try to contribute back to anything that's helped me along in my photographic path, and
Yeah, cool.
And I think I'm in favour of the small communities.
I should go back and see if my login still works, if I can remember. But
I think it expires after 90 days. So.
Does it? Oh, well,
Yeah.
probably won't be there then.
Yeah.
Never mind. All right. We'll probably have to think about wrapping up. I've got a couple of questions for you. Are there any photographers out there that you think I should be talking to?
Yeah, I had a look through your podcast list of people you've spoken to, and I reckon I'm going to give a shout out to the people I've gone hiking in Tassie with, because I spent a lot of time with them. You've already spoken. Have you spoken to Luke on this podcast?
Yeah, Luke and Paul I've spoken to down there.
The other chap I went with on the Eastern Arthurs trip was Nathan Mattinson.
Okay.
Yep. I don't think he posts a lot on social media, but what he does post is very natural, very high quality work. Right. Always does well in the Natural Photography Awards run by Alex Nail. So I think he'd be worth having a chat to. And just for a change of direction type of photographer, do you know Tim Ray?
Yep.
Yeah, have you had him on the show at all? Or?
I haven't had him on the show. He was on my list though. So
yeah, so as I said, he used to come with us on these hikes to Tassie, but now through life circumstances, I think he's gone much more into aerials and is killing it, basically.
Yeah,
so having a chat to him about that kind of thing would be good. And from a local perspective, particularly if you wanted to talk about photography as a business, Ben Good would be a good chap to have a chat to, because I think he's using that as photography as a primary kind of breadwinner for him.
Yeah.
But he seems to be doing pretty well. So I hope I'm right about that. But yeah, for more of a focus on promotioning, making a business out of photography, he might be a good one to chat to.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
All right, I've got my last question, and for most of my listeners, it's the most important one I ask.
Yep.
Do you like pineapple on pizza?
I don't mind it. The kids love it. I will not throw away a pizza if pineapple's on it.
Fair enough. I'm the same. I won't order it, but if it's there and I'm feeling like pizza, it goes in.
Yeah, that's right. No objection to it, but not desired.
Thank you very much for taking the time tonight, Dylan. It's been wonderful getting to know you a little bit better and learning more about how you do what you do. Where can people find your work?
I'm on Instagram on Everlook_photography, and also on Facebook under the same handle. They're the main two places I post. If anyone still uses 500px, I'm on there as well under Dylan Toe. But we have a website, everlookphotography.com as well. So lots of places to find us if you search Everlook Photography. But yeah.
Thank you, Dylan. It's been great.
No problems.
Thanks again for listening to Landscape Photography World. I hope you enjoyed the show, and keep listening because I'll be joined by some great guests in upcoming episodes. You can find my work in this podcast at grantswinburnphotography.com. I'm also on Vero, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. I'm Grant Swinburne. Hope to see you out shooting soon.